somehow, this game died twice, angered their community beyond repair, survived a raid from 4chan, and suffered the wrath of a 16-year-old boy. God damn. This is What Went Wrong with Face of Mankind, a game that I doubt you've ever heard of, but tells an interesting story and shines a light on MMO FPS games that rely heavily on their community to provide content. And I'm your host, WickedWiz, being a man of my word and standing in a dystopian sci-fi, attempting to explain what happened to a game that even the Wayback Machine struggles to remember. I mean, this game is old. We're talking from the mid-2000s here. There are a lot of missing links, unarchived pages, and multiple forums nuked to oblivion. As a result, this story nearly drove me insane. At times, it was like trying to find a clean scroll in the Library of Alexandria. It wasn't easy, so I reached out to some people who played the game and also got in contact with one of the developers. However, you really had to be there to grasp the full context of things. So I apologize in advance if some parts are rather vague. But this story comes in 3 phases, each of which as damning as the next. This story begins all the way back in the year 2001, with this man right here, Marco Dykman, a name that I've probably already mispronounced. He came up with the idea to create a largely player-driven game where people decide the fate of the galaxy and write their own story. A game that others have drawn similarities to with EVE Online or this game here called Neocron. But Face of Mankind was still a very different and unique experience. Marco asked the question, why not just give players the power to decide for themselves? And that if you offer the power to commit crimes, then you also have to offer the power to punish them too. His answer to this was to develop a world in which the players control the politics, economics, war, and justice systems through roleplay, where the community both drives the narrative and provides the core content. You may think that with all this freedom, only chaos will ensue, but similar to RP servers that you see today, people took their roles quite seriously.
The Face of Mankind works so well because it's essentially like an online version of the Stanford prison experiment, and everyone just like gets brainwashed into taking to their roles so well they start kind of like making the fictional system like work, but it's all player driven. And I've never seen a game do it quite the same way. It's like a give them enough rope scenario.
The Stanford prison experiment is quite an extreme example, but it gives you a good idea as to how invested some players were when it came to this game. Now, what about the game itself, the mechanics, the way it works, and how people actually played it? Well, the general experience is that you log in, create your character, join a faction, and then the world is your oyster. From there, you can explore many off-world colonies or earthbound cities. But there wasn't much in the way of an onboarding system or in-depth tutorial, so you pretty much had to figure things out for yourself and ask other players, which didn't make it the most user-friendly game for new players. And we'll talk more about that later when it's more relevant, because this is one of the main sticking points behind this game. Now, there weren't that many mechanics besides combat, making and selling gear, and touching terminals all day. Most of the experience was through interacting with other players, which of course could be done in-game via basic communication features such as chat, emotes, and the ability to say,
"I love you."
But most events and communication really happened both on the forum and Ventrilo, the Discord before there was Discord. As I've mentioned, this game had combat and PvP was always on pretty much everywhere, with exception to some safe zones here and there. In theory, you could jump in, buy a weapon, and go absolutely nuts, but not without consequence, because this game had permadeath. If you run out of clones and have no money to buy more, then you have to start all over again with a new character. So to really progress in this game, you had to play along. I mean, you could roleplay as a criminal and be strategic about it, but depending on where you are, police roam the streets and will likely throw you in jail if you commit a crime. Policing in this game was also completely player driven, and they even had their own academy.
The police had like a training academy where new players would go through before they were allowed to do certain things like arrest people and have any real authority. So you have to sit in these classes run by players, and there were tests and stuff like that.
The faction system in this game is very important to the story. In the early days, there were 3 governmental institutions, the FDC, GIS, and LED. There were also 4 multinational companies and 3 clans. But later this changed, and you basically had 8 factions to choose from. The whole point with factions is that they drive the narrative, with reason behind each action while providing some sense of structure in a world where you can do anything.
Essentially, there's like a hierarchical structure in each of them, and tools. The higher up you go in the chain to punish the people below you, find them credits and send them to jail and just kick them out of your faction if you want, sort of social isolation ultimately. So the people in charge of the hierarchy and all these factions were role players who had very distinct ideas about what those factions should be and how they should operate. And so from the top down, there was this culture of roleplay that ultimately led to sort of a structure for the game's story and a way to play the game.
Progression in this game largely relied on your own skill, whether it be the combat system, your ability to lead, socialize, your overall knowledge of the factions, and who to trust or to be wary of. There was a ranking system that went from 1 to 7, and you could gain XP through player-made missions, but ranks were assigned by higher-ups in the chain of command. It really depends on your performance and reputation, or who's in power at that specific time. Rank 7 was reserved for the faction leader. It was more of a hands-off role, but came with a lot of responsibility and power. Most rank 7s were also game moderators, or GMs for short, which is a title that you'd have to apply for, meaning that this wasn't an easy position to obtain. But rank 6 members still had a lot of power and contributed to the storyline with major events and so on. But how much so depends on which faction you're in and who's at the top. Anyway, there's a lot more to it than that, but I hope you now have a decent general idea as to what this game was all about. A lot of it changes here and there, but with this concept in mind, Marco set up his Berlin-based studio called Duplex Systems. Straight away, he hired an artist for concept art so that the game had a look and feel, and also hired on some developers who apparently didn't have any experience with MMOs and didn't receive pay at first, but they were committed and up for the challenge. After a couple of years in development, a good amount of progress was made, and anyone interested could see for themselves in 2003 when they released their first trailer. It starts off with a woman in a field, daydreaming about her low poly character. Then you see the different worlds, then fighting, some dude dancing, and for some reason this guy decked out in a trench coat, looking up at the sky whilst being shot at, and his mate in the background shooting at a wall. Around this time, people could go to their website and sign up for the closed beta that was set to launch on the 5th of April 2004. But those who did sign up received their invite one day before, on the 4th of April, not the 5th. On the surface, this sounds like good news. However, the reason behind it wasn't too great for the team. In a behind-the-scenes diary from Marco regarding beta testing, there were issues with their beta portal account interface, meaning that those who signed up did so with invalid data to no fault of their own. This meant that the team at Duplex had to manually invite everyone who signed up, and apparently doing so one by one while fixing the database entries by hand. But with that out of the way, these guys were just excited to see other people play their game for the first time. However, after only just 5 minutes, the server crashed. And unfortunately, this happened multiple times. I mean, it's to be expected when it comes to testing, but it still wasn't the best launch. Thankfully though, after a couple of days and sleepless nights, they eventually found the issue and resolved it, along with many other critical issues within this phase of testing. However, there was one glaring issue that pretty much every small team struggles with, and that is being a small team. As you can imagine, they had a heavy workload. There was testing the game, adding promised features, managing a community, and so on. On top of all of that, there's also marketing, which is a very necessary beast to conquer, as without it, nobody's really gonna know about your game. So Duplex really needed help in this department, but little did they know, that help would come in the form of a small but relevant mobile company called Oyom. Since the beginning of development, Duplex were on the lookout for a publisher, and during beta testing, Oyom got in touch with an offer to become the publisher for Face of Mankind. Now, Oyom had little to no experience within the MMO space, let alone PC gaming. However, they did have experience within the mobile gaming space. But although the early to mid 2000s was a great time for mobile games without all the ads and the the microtransactions, and whatever the hell this is. The difference between something like this and an MMO FPS like Face of Mankind is still quite big, especially when it comes to understanding the MMO market. But it seemed that for Duplex, a publisher is a publisher regardless of their experience. So of course they accepted Oyom's offer. To be fair, Oyom were looking to enter the MMO space and saw potential in Face of Mankind. They also had the resources available to provide marketing and support the servers. But interestingly, Oyom were also going to help out with the community side of things. And it's something that they seem to have an interest in. From what I heard, this help was in the form of a newly appointed community manager that had a lot of power and control over the forums. But this individual, known as Smoker, wasn't liked very much. Apparently, he was a bit of an idiot with double standards. And the way the forums were managed, especially later on, would go on to cause a disaster that we'll see later. Now, the beta testing phase lasted for nearly 2 years, from April 2004 to March 2006. Within this time, a lot changed per milestone. And on the 9th of December 2005, one notable patch or set of patches came with a move to a new game engine. This of course required a lot of work, as all the worlds had to be updated, character models changed, new features added, and existing ones also changed. Along with this was a massive wipe in prep for release, as well as the removal of 2 factions, leaving now only 8. Now, the wipe was already mentioned before these changes, but it became this looming threat to a lot of progress that had already been made by existing players. And this would only be just one contributing factor as to why quite a lot of people left before release. And in a Reddit AMA, Marco says, "I wouldn't recommend any developer to update your game engine during open beta. Smiley face." Now, behind the scenes, a decision as to how this game would be monetized was already made, and it wasn't the best decision either. You see, Oyom were to set in place a pay-to-play subscription service which was planned for release. The issue with it was that there was no free trial or any way for people to figure out if it was worth their money or not. Apparently, it was something that people were aware of before release. However, this only added a doomsday countdown for those who wouldn't be able to afford it. So with this, the player base already began to shrink in size. When the game was released, first digitally on the 27th of March 2006, the payment system was in full swing, but not everybody was happy with the final results of the game. To some, it seemed unfinished and required more time in the beta. But overall, this release was a bit of a flop. There was no massive influx of new players or anything like that. But why? Well, firstly, Oyom had these detailed plans for retail that Marco seemed confident in, so there wasn't much in the way of an ad campaign for digital. Instead, it was reserved for retail. Secondly, new players had to think twice before spending cash on a game that they don't even know if they like yet. But when retail came to stores a few months later in August, not many copies were sold and the game didn't really see any real growth. It wasn't a total failure, but it just wasn't enough. Even worse for Duplex is that Oyom's payment system was completely broken. People quickly figured out that if you remove your credit card details, you can still play the game for free. So as you can imagine, even though it was self-inflicted, none of this looked good in both the eyes of Duplex and Oyom. Especially for Oyom, regardless of their failures, they still took a risk with Face of Mankind, so things better improve before Duplex has to find someone else to publish and support their game. And this is where things get really messy. In May 2007, something quite terrible but probably expected to happen at some point finally happened. The official portal became inaccessible due to multiple DDoS attacks, which shut down the forum and made the game barely playable, as a lot of the story and progression was done via the forums. It was said to be so devastating that the player base shrunk down from about 10k to around 1500 during the attacks. And there didn't seem to be anything in place to prevent this from happening. As you can imagine, this was a massive hit to both the community and developers. In response to this, Oyom launched an investigation to try and find the culprit or culprits. Turns out that it was a 16-year-old boy who launched an SYN flood attack. And according to this article, a police investigation led by Scotland Yard's Computer Crime Unit led to the arrest of a computer studies student in London in October 2007. He admitted responsibility, stating that he and his friends launched the attack after deciding deciding to take down the forum over dissatisfaction about the way it was being run. Now, apparently later attacks were using botnets, but those cost money and therefore can't last forever. So eventually the game came back online, but the damage had already been done. It seemed that this dissatisfaction with the way that the forum was managed, most likely in retaliation towards the community manager, reached a boiling point that resulted in a teen getting arrested and Oyom having to make a big decision. This decision was to end all support for Face of Mankind by the end of November. This was possibly the worst thing that could happen to an already struggling game, as to run the servers without Oyom's support would be nearly impossible. So with Oyom out of the picture, what was the fate of this game? Well, in an article titled "The Future of Mankind," it was made clear that Duplex didn't want to give up. However, it would be financially difficult to run these servers as they were. So they planned to simplify not just the game, but the portal and server structure as well. However, none of this could really be resolved in time by the end of the month when Oyom officially left. So the servers shut down. With everything offline, Marco decided to work on a new version called Face of Mankind Rebirth. This was meant to be a revival, to give it something more while making it easier to manage with less support. But as development continued and the dev blog slowed down, Face of Mankind Rebirth was eventually cancelled. In a heartfelt statement, Marco explained that with a small team and limited resources plus a lack in funding, that they weren't able to improve the game the way they wanted. Now, to be clear, the game ran fine before Oyom left, but from their perspective, it just didn't make too much sense to carry on. Apparently, they did look for other ways to fund the game, via investment or from another publisher, but that was it. The game shut down and all was dark. However, Face of Mankind meant a lot to the people who played it. There was this deep connection through the player-made stories and countless adventures, as well as many friendships that formed along the way. So surely this can't just all end. Well, thankfully for the remaining community, it didn't, and in the shadows, a notorious hacker and well-known community member called Extra Crispy began working on a server emulator with the hope to bring it back to life. This was meant to be a revival of sorts, and the players were the ones to do it. However, Marco eventually caught wind of this. Apparently, he first attempted to take legal action, but realized that people still wanted to play the game and that it could potentially find success the second time round. With this realization, he decided to give it another go and began reworking the netcode for better scalability, as the previous server requirements were a lot. So Marco was back to work with the game, and you could argue that without the community, this story would end here. However, while Marco was working on his revised netcode, something quite interesting happened. All the way over in Houston, Texas, a small group of employees who all played Face of Mankind wondered if they could be the ones to bring the game back to life. These were all employees of a company called Nexion Technologies, and they offered multiple server solutions as well as the much needed DDoS defense. So the CEO of Nexion, Charles Wood, got in touch with Marco to see what was going on and attempted to make an offer for the rights of the game. Because Marco hadn't given up on the game entirely, the negotiations went on for a while, but they both came to the agreement that Nexion would manage the server side of things while Marco leads the game development. Later, on the 3rd of December 2008, the previously dead website came back with a new forum and an announcement. This post right here spoke quite frankly to the community, and it confirmed that the game was coming back at some point, but also that this time the game would be stripped back and things would be kept simple. Not too long after this, the closed beta began on the 20th of February 2009, with the open beta following later in the year on the 5th of December, and on the 29th, the game was re-released. This time it ran on a freemium model where people could play the game for free but with limited features, or pay about $10 per month for the full thing. But this revival further highlighted some issues that only seemed to get worse over time. Now, within the next 3 years, there's a lot of drama and individual events that, to be honest, would require its own channel to talk about. But one notable change that came with this version, and I kid you not, was democracy. More specifically, the ability for players to vote for the next faction leaders, instead of what they had before, where you either had to be staff or a GM for a good shot at the role. This voting system of course provided more freedom, which is great for a player-driven game, but I've heard multiple opinions about this, and generally speaking, faction leadership became more of a popularity contest than anything else. I mean, it's democracy after all.
So, Face of Mankind always had a slight imbalance towards combatants, but they were kept in check by politically motivated players. The problem is that the politically motivated players weren't as popular as the combatants, so you started to see more, less politically inclined players being elected, which made the game a little bit more combat-oriented, making those players leave the game, decreasing the pool of politically minded players to be elected in the first place. So over time, you end up with this just decline in the quality of leadership towards people who are less interested in culture and identity and sort of narrative, and just wanted to fight each other, and like just killing people was the only thing they wanted to do. And when the people from the very top just like, let's just go kill everybody and take over the game, you end up with this environment of just constant warfare.
This highlighted a very real problem with games like this. Face of Mankind relied entirely on its community. The mechanics were simply there to provide a playground, but the community offers the experience. If this goes out of balance, then so does the game. However, like anything, it's subjective. For some, this was the best time, with a lot of stories to share about epic wars, conquest, and defying the odds. But still, it was a change that brought instability for both new and existing players.
Very, very beginning of the game, you knew that a faction, based on its faction description, would do at least vaguely what that faction description said. If you joined a corporation, there was going to be a GM rank 7 who guided the rank 6s who made most of the decisions about where the faction was going into, like, well, we're here to make money. The Brotherhood are criminals. We're here to sell drugs and do shady shit. They kept them going a certain direction. Once they introduced the player voting for the rank 7 thing, it became popularity contests, and like Eurocore was just like, oh, we just want to beef with everybody. We're going to go around and start every war we can because we're big and we can win. And that became such a problem when they introduced this thing where all of the rank 7s had to get approval for when we wanted to do anything major.
As you heard right there, the developers imposed a new rule where faction leaders required permission for major events. This did stop a lot of fighting, but the game quickly slowed down. Now, of course, with a new change like this, there were a lot of people getting banned and straight up leaving. Even though this game didn't need a massive population to feel full, the lack of growth and slow decay of the player base made it clear that this game wasn't commercially viable, and that it was only a matter of time until it all fell apart. So as time went on, the developers became disillusioned with their game, and on the 11th of November 2010, Nexion took over while Marco went off to work on something else. From a business standpoint, it didn't make much sense for Nexion to keep the game going, but they were players since the early days, so I'm sure there was more of a sentimental reason. However, nothing really improved in the hands of Nexion. The game wasn't making any money, there was no budget for any real marketing campaign, and most updates came at a loss. Since the re-release, the game was always stuck in its own corner of the internet with a small but very dedicated community. Some attempts to revamp specific systems such as combat did bring in some new players, but none of it really lasted for long. The issue for new players was that your experience is highly dependent on the community, because as I've said before, players provide the content. So as a new player, you could be lucky and join at the right time with loads of activity and things to do, but also join at a time when nothing's really happening. It really did come down to the community to make things happen, but again, this wasn't easy with the need for permission all the time. But even when people went out of their way to bring some life back into the game, Nexion were more concerned about the way they went about it rather than the results.
The game was like at a point where it was like really lowly popular. Like a lot of people were technically playing, had active accounts, but you could walk through some of the major hubs and you wouldn't see like really anyone except for the occasional person who was AFK at a mining terminal doing something. That's because no one was at war with each other. Everyone had colonies that they were relatively happy with, or the faction was low in population. They didn't feel confident about starting a war. Nothing was happening. I had felt comfortable talking to Chris about, I think this is a bad situation this game is in. No one's doing anything. It's dull. Everyone's sitting around doing nothing on their colonies. I'm just going to start a war with damn near almost every other faction, because even if we lose, that gets people logging in. I woke up the next morning to a message getting absolutely reamed by one of the other dudes in Nexion about the fact that I didn't ask them for their permission to do this. That I didn't formal faction leader only forum section that they could review when they decided that they wanted to get more activity with and more guidance for the faction leaders. And my response to that was like, I talked to Chris. Like, Chris is the dev. Like, I thought that was enough. He told me go for it. And they're like, no, you needed to be like, basically you needed to sign the paperwork. You needed to put in we didn't get the TPS reports or whatever.
Now, this is just one of many examples that shines a light on another issue, which was this ever-growing divide between what the developers think is best for the game versus the players. And another example is when some people from 4chan decided to raid the game. It all started with a few posts being sent around warning of this massive invasion. And of course, this didn't sit well with the community, because they didn't want some random gank squad running around ruining the game. So on this rare occasion, the factions came together and prepared for attack. When the horde arrived, the battle begun, but they were of course no match for the heavily geared veterans, so it was a quick and decisive win for Face of Mankind. For the players, it was a moment in history where the community defended the game. However, regardless of any context, from the eyes on Nexion, this just looked like people ganking new players. And to some of those who took part, it always felt like there was this resentment towards them since this day. Resentment that will come full swing very soon, as this game was still not making any money and something had to be done to save it. On the 7th of May 2013, a Kickstarter campaign was launched for Face of Mankind, although this time it was a new edition called Fall of the Dominion. The project was led by Chris, somebody who helped to give me some insight into this game, and was also the lead developer and designer for this new phase. In the grand scheme of things, Fall of the Dominion was the game's last hope to keep it alive. The main changes were the following. Instead of hard-coded factions, players can now make their own. The economic system was reworked with more depth. The combat system was changed in order to balance the skill curve for new players. There were also going to be full loot drops, so combat was more punishable. And they wanted to add some kind of in-game progression with a horizontal skill system where you can specialize in specific roles. The Kickstarter itself is quite lengthy and it came with some pretty big stretch goals. But the most interesting thing was the amount that people were willing to pay to keep this game alive. The pledge price went from $5 all the way up to $10,000, with 2 backers on the $6,000, 1 on the $3,500, and a total of 2 on the $2,500. A lot of the pledges under this were in the hundreds, and most people just looking for early access went for the $30 pledge. But either way, it was a successful campaign, and with that, development was underway. The game was also successfully greenlit on Steam, which means we have access to all of these lovely reviews. Not all of them are negative, but as we'll see very soon, things really do take a turn for the worse, because this new version of the game really didn't last long. You see, the open beta or early access was successfully launched on the 10th of April 2014. Following that was the release of the game on the 18th of July, and on the 3rd of September 2015, the game, for a second time, died. What the hell happened? Well, quite a lot, and forgive me if I oversimplify some bits, but it comes down to 3 main things: the game itself, the new players, and the developers. Firstly, this game didn't change that much, at least visually, compared to what it was before. It of course had its fair share of bugs and ancient systems, but for a new game on Steam, regardless of its history, it was simply outdated compared to the competition. Even though they secured around 60k, which with cuts came down to even less, it was still nowhere near enough to rebuild the whole game on a new engine. So they reused all of the old assets, and the changes were mostly for the core systems. It's not like there weren't any improvements, but things like the new player-made faction system didn't go down too well. You see, the old factions were abolished and removed from the game. There were no longer any of these hard-coded factions, so people could really make any kind of faction that they want. So of course there were meme factions, there were people not really taking it too seriously, and the old players weren't all too happy with the fact that these factions that have been around since forever have now been completely removed. However, this didn't really stop players from bringing them back. Now, regarding the new player experience, it wasn't the best. First, you have this bare bones tutorial where you go from one NPC to another and read walls of text. Then it ends and you have to figure out what to do next. Because there's no typical questline and the whole point of the game is to get involved with roleplay, it didn't appeal to everyone, but at least there was combat, and the prospect of fighting for your own faction was appealing to a lot of people. Because, like I said before, reputation means everything, and if you could be known as that guy who's really good at PvP, then at least you can get something from this game. However, with a game like this that had an already established community, bridging the skill gap with veterans seemed impossible, and competition was difficult to say the least. Even with the player-made faction system, you had to compete against the top factions, which were all owned by veterans.
I think it was the best shot they had at making the game profitable. Like, you know, deciding that, okay, we're not going to have hard-coded factions, we're going to let people make their own factions, that way we don't give a fuck what they're doing. Made sense, but really the biggest factions in the game that ran everything were still the old guys who ran everything before. I know, because I was one of them.
Not to mention that this version of the game was much more hardcore, as you can lose everything upon death, and now people can break into your apartment. However, this didn't make it impossible to get good or even get involved with the game. It just wasn't the most accessible experience for this new influx of players. Now, of course, new players mean money, and with the prospect of the game finally making some, monetization quickly got out of hand. For example, in the beginning, the game was free to play, with the option to pay for premium or spend ridiculous amounts of money on other packs. But later down the line, it became pay to play. What made this worse was the fact that existing players now had to buy the game, even for existing players who already had premium. Just to give you an idea as to how well this went down with the players, before this change, the reviews were mixed, but now mostly negative, and this was one of the changes that really kicked down the player count, because now new players can't try it out for free, and just looking at the reviews, it may not seem like the best purchase. Another example was the player-made faction system. In the past, factions didn't cost money, they were just a part of the game. You'd simply pick a faction and there you go. However, in the Steam release, it became a premium feature to own a faction. If that doesn't already sound bad enough, just remember that the core content from this game was made by the players. The action, the drama, the everything, all came from the players, and this was always the case. But now, people had to pay for that privilege. And we've only just scratched the surface, because apparently it was way worse.
You know, there's cosmetics and things like that, but not all of them were cosmetic. Like, they'd make these kits and they would have like overpowered weapons in them, and you could buy this kit and get these crazy med kits, but you only got an X number amount. So if you were like a bottomless pocket griefer, you could just constantly just have these. I mean, there were all kinds of, there's this really good set of armor, but like in a game like this, the armor you use several sets of armor in a single day when you're in a war, right? So it's just like there were these crazy whale items thrown into the mix, and I always felt like it was with bad intentions, because they knew that they were ripping off the players. It becomes a very emotional thing. I mean, it's all very well reasoned, but the in-game mechanics always kind of influenced how you felt about it. And when the pay-to-win thing started creeping in, even though it was people getting ripped off for a split second or two, they had an unfair advantage, and that just riled people up more,
Now, I know I focused a lot on the monetization here, but there didn't seem to be that much in the way of new content either. There were these portable turrets, but that just added to the griefing problem. When people had something negative to say about development, the choices being made, and the GMs, they could very quickly find themselves banned. So it seemed that the only way to quell negative opinions was to simply remove them, which is never a good idea and only angers the community further. So what was the response from players? Well, people left, and by the looks of it, quite a lot. You see, the community was already fractured, with new players trying to find their place and old players feeling rejected. Since the voting system all the way back in 2009, the balance within the community shifted, at least from the perspective of those who played the first beta. But now it was totally broken. Not all, but some of the developers had this distaste and blame for the veterans. To them, it seemed like it was their fault for new players leaving. And this post right here gives us a good idea as to how developers felt towards the veterans. Now, there's a lot in this post, and it's a response to people ganking other players. Besides threatening to shut down the forums for their loyal followers and telling long-time players that they know what's best for the game, it's clear that Nexion struggled to bridge the gap between new and old players. It's an issue that's been around since forever, but here it was way worse, as the player base began to break down. Every game has some level of toxicity, and there are many factors to consider when trying to find the cause. One main factor, at least for this game, wasn't just people getting salty and taking out their revenge on others. It came down to the lack of systems in place to prevent griefing. And in an open world PvP game, it's easier said than done to prevent this. You can complain all day about people camping the borders of a safe zone, but if there's nothing in place to prevent this, then it'll happen regardless, and even more so when everything turns to anarchy. By design, it was very easy to ruin someone's day, with full loot drops and the ability to break into apartments. In this world, with roleplay aside, it's all about gaining power, securing dominance, and competing against other factions. Fighting always came down to a matter of attrition, so if a new player buys the game, makes some progress, and then gets destroyed over and over again, then they either take a break and give it another go, or log off for good. But what was in place? What core mechanics were there to prevent this? Well, they did have penalty points and jail time, but it didn't do too much to prevent people from ganking and looting other players. Later down the line, they did try to bring back the Senate and also the LED just to bring some more order and roleplay, but it was already too late. When competing with others, it very much came down to your own skill and ability. The combat system may change, but there was still this dance to combat, something that you really had to practice and get good at. So if the veterans are flat out better than the new players who are also trying to compete for power, then is it their responsibility to play nice? Of course not, but it will make the experience more welcoming to new players. Intentionally driving away new players is like slamming your own foot in the door, because with less players, the game will struggle financially and will eventually result in its own demise. But the point is that this game, by design, allowed this to happen. From the beginning, it was always about the freedom to do what you want. What made it great was that the players create structure and enforce the rules. So what's permissible in the game is possible, just not without consequence from the community. It wasn't perfect, but there was a clear structure of roleplay, and the community managed itself with built-in factions that each played a specific role. The need for power was there, but faction leaders maintained some kind of direction and purpose other than domination. What made no sense to me was when the voting system came in place where anyone could become a faction leader, the developers tried to control it because it got out of hand. But in this new release, it goes a step further, where anyone can make their own faction. With a game that advertises a lot of battles and conflict, it came at no surprise that there were factions with the sole purpose to take over with any means necessary. So without the structure from before and the ever-growing distaste towards the developers, any sense of order turns into chaos and anarchy fills its place. What is permissible still exists, but now stability and order comes down to the developers to resolve, which only angered people further and caused more issues. Now, from what I've heard and seen in other places, this wasn't the worst game on Steam. And trust me, I've already played a couple on my second channel. But in the end, it left everybody with a sour taste in their mouth and nobody won. I feel bad for the new players who paid to play this game and got crushed by an outraged few. I feel bad for the veterans who also supported this game and saw it go downhill like this. This game clearly ran its course, and it was a miracle that it even got to this point. It had many chances, but the moment it found some kind of success, it all fell apart. And with that all said and done, on the very last day, the developers and players got together to have one last bit of fun before the servers shut down for good. Believe it or not, this may not entirely be the end, because there's this: Mankind Reborn, a spiritual successor to Face of Mankind, which is currently in development by the one player who actually enjoyed Fall of the Dominion. I can't say much about it right now besides the fact that it's not Face of Mankind 2.0, but it is similar in many ways with a keen focus on combat. However, it has been on pause for a while, and I did reach out to see if this game is still in development. To my surprise, I got a quick response, and they were very open about their struggles. But I can say that this project hasn't been abandoned, not just yet, so we'll just have to wait and see if anything comes from it. If you're interested, you can go check out their website, although I've been told to mention that it's a bit out of date. However, you can still find a lot of information there just to get a good idea. I honestly hope they catch some wind with this new game, and if it goes wrong, then that is more content for me. But in all seriousness, it's really weird looking from the outside in, trying to understand an entire game and its culture, like some sort of basement-dwelling archaeologist. Like I said, it wasn't easy, and I only hope I did it justice, or at the very least, brought some attention back to a game which meant a lot to those who played it. Regardless of all the negatives, the people I spoke to, the community that lingers, and recent posts all look back with nostalgia. This game clearly had something unique about it, and we've only scratched the surface in this video. There are countless stories lost to time, but the community is still out there in some form or another. And if I can only ask one thing from the people who played this game, it would be to share your stories, both good and bad, whether it be in a video of your own or within the flames of the comment section below. Because as small as this game was, it packed one hell of a punch, and I honestly never thought it would get this deep. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna go touch some grass and maybe have a shower. Like the video, subscribe if you want more, and hit that bell button because my upload schedule is whack. And of course, I'd love to say a massive thanks to all of my supporters over on Patreon. Honestly, you guys help out so much, and I have nothing but appreciation for you sticking around. And finally, special thanks to my Wicked Slayers and Cyber Nerds, Cyber Wizards, Negadan, Gibbles by the Dozen, Time Wiz, Anastasis, Wick Nola, The Cuddly Bot, Montana Tuska, Rare Alex, Basto, Finra, Alex Caprol, Lynn Kerr, Mr. Pine, Spooky, Artistical, Roselle Bugatti, King Swing, Distant Reality, Legayana, Draga Funyan, Christian Barbu, and Shadow Banisher. You guys are super cool. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in the next one, sooner than the last, where I stand in an old friend's house.